So in the morning, we started by saying that love seems to be the most important factor in human life, and yet it is missing from our life. We also mentioned that it is said that if you have everything else except love, then that everything else is not enough. Without love, it doesn't mean much. But if we have nothing else except love, then that love can get you everything. So it is that important a factor, a quality. And it is very strange that it is almost missing completely from our life. So then we said that how does one approach this love? I mean, how does one discover it? How does one enquire into it? How does one approach it? So a question is naturally arises in our mind that what is that action or what is it that will bring this quality into our life? And then there we take the reference of Krishnamurti, who says that love is not the product of thought. Love is not just one more content of our consciousness. In fact, he says that love is a totally different dimension, which has nothing to do with the field of knowledge, nothing to do with the consciousness as Krishnamurti has defined. It is totally different. So now an entity who is living in the field of knowledge, the entity who is also the product of that knowledge, now how that entity is going to find out what love is, which is not the product of knowledge, which is not the content of that field, which is outside that field. So entity living in a field, how can it find out something which is not in that field, which is completely outside that field? So that has been the problem. So naturally, any positive action in the sense of trying to search for it is of no use, because that search will be done in the field of knowledge, because the entity which is the product of that field, so that entity searching for something, right, then it can search for that something only in that field of knowledge. It cannot search it somewhere where it is not there, or where it is not able to even move or go. So wherever it is, it exists in the field of knowledge. So it is going to search for it only in the field of knowledge. And then whatever it may think of love, all those thoughts will be still belonging to that field of knowledge. And all that it can find through its search is its own concepts, its own ideas about what love is. And therefore, it is not that actual love. It is only an idea of that actual. And so it is not love at all. It is just the product of the very entity who is trying to find that love. So therefore, all such endeavor, it comes to nothing. It is worthless. It will not lead us anywhere. because we are trying to search something in the field where it doesn't exist at all. So all search must come to an end. But this search doesn't come to an end because we have our own ideas of what love is. So we live our life, our daily life, and in that daily life, whatever states of mind, whatever psychological experiences we go through, in that we have identified certain experiences or certain content as the indication of love. So for us, desire is love. For us, attachment is love. For us, the fear is love, and so on. So we have all these notions about what love is, and those notions keep us moving in the field of knowledge. And if at all we say that those notions may not be love, still our search will be based on those notions only. And therefore, if one has to enter into a completely different dimension, then all the activity in the given dimension, they have to come to an end. We had taken an example of an aeroplane running on the ground but never taking off. So our activities in the field of knowledge are like that. So we are spending all our energy in all those various activities, and then we have no energy left to take off. And therefore, how does one come to end these activities? Now, you cannot deliberately end them. If you try to deliberately end, then you are going to lose everything. Then you are left with nothing. So that plane, it is neither taking off, but now it is also disabled to move on the ground also. So that will be the condition if you deliberately try to end this. So that is where the approach of negation comes, which means that whatever our activities, whatever our notions, right, through the understanding of those notions, through the understanding of those activities, the futility of those things are noticed, are understood, and as a result of that understanding, those activities, they simply drop, they simply stop, because we see that there is no point in the continuation of these activities. And when the activities, they end in this manner, then that energy which was being utilized in those activities, that energy becomes the energy of your enquiry. So Krishnaji calls that energy as passion. So you have lots of passion, but a passion which has no specific direction, because there is a lot of passion. People do have a lot of passion in their life, but all that passion is directed towards something. A businessman is very passionate about his business. He wants to make as much profit as possible. A person who is ambitious, then he is very passionate about what he wants to achieve. Then a fanatic religious person, is very passionate about his beliefs, his faiths, and if contradicted, that same passion works as a destructive energy. So not that kind of passion, but a passion which has no specific direction. So Krishnaji calls such a passion as the passion for all. That means there is no specific thing about which you are passionate, but you are passionate by itself, not passionate for something, passionate per se. And that passion can function towards anything or towards everything. So it is passion for all. And when it is passion for all, Krishnaji calls it as compassion. So compassion means passion for all. And then he says that compassion is the beginning of love. So that seems to be the approach. Starting from our daily life and negating the activities which are not love. And through negation, generating a lot of passion, and that passion leading to that quality of love. So that seems to be the journey. And I explained in the morning that this approach of negation is possible here in the exploration in the psychological field, because it is not just love, but whenever Krishnaji talks about any positive quality, that positive quality he talks in an absolute sense. And when he talks about in an absolute sense, which means that it is not opposite to something. Like when he talks about freedom, then freedom is not opposite to bondage. He also says that freedom is not freedom from something, because freedom from something is a relative freedom, so it is not freedom at all, but freedom per se. When he talks about order, right, so it is not an order according to some pattern, according to some discipline, but that order is by itself, and it can be by itself only when all the factors creating disorder are absent. So which means that we don't have to run after the order, but we have to live with those factors of disorder, and then out of understanding those factors and those factors then coming to an end, and then the order is there by itself. So that has been the approach to all this. And he does say that there is a completely different dimension to human life, because without that, this approach is also not valid. For example, if you want to apply the same approach to a machine, then in the life of the machine, there is no question of a different dimension at all. The machine is completely the product of thought, the product of the field of knowledge. There is no other dimension of existence to the machine except whatever is in the field of knowledge. And therefore, there the approach of negation is completely useless. Because if you negate all the knowledge, then there is nothing left. The machine is finished, over. But human beings, for human beings, there is a possibility of a completely different dimension of existence. And therefore, the approach of negation becomes valid. So negation appears in different ways when Krishnaji talks about different things in his teaching. That is, for example, when he talks about ending of the known, when he talks about end of knowledge. So what does end of knowledge mean? Well, if we just take that statement by itself, a person is confused, because he says that the knowledge is necessary in his day-to-day life, and if he ends all that knowledge, then how can he function in his day-to-day life? So that question is also a valid question. So when Krishnaji talks of end of knowledge, he is actually talking of end of the knower. The knower, who is the product of knowledge? The knower is the product of knowledge. And that knower is deciding everything according to its knowledge. So the end of knowledge is the end of the knower. That means the knower with all its activities coming to an end. Then Krishnaji also talks about the approach which is based on I don't know. Now, even if you say I don't know, right, it doesn't mean much. Because whenever you want to find out something which is totally new, which is not related to whatever knowledge you have, right, then you have to begin afresh. You cannot begin from the known, because that known has nothing to do with that which you want to find out, because that which you want to find out is a completely new thing. So if it is completely new, it has nothing to do with the old, and all the knowledge is old. So with the help of knowledge, if you are trying to discover something which is totally new, then it's not possible. You cannot find it that way. In fact, the knowledge then becomes an hindrance, because that knowledge will color your investigation. So you will investigate according to that knowledge, and therefore you are going to completely miss something which is totally new. Right? So when you say I don't know, it is not just an intellectual statement. When you say I don't know, which means that you have put aside all your knowledge. So the brain is not looking for any knowledge. Brain is not trying to interpret anything in terms of knowledge. The brain is not trying to interfere with the help of that knowledge. So Krishnaji calls it as the state of not knowing. Only in the state of not knowing, something which is totally new can happen, can come into being. So the state of not knowing is again a form of negation, where all the knowledge is completely negated, because one understands that that knowledge is not helpful in finding out something which doesn't belong to the field of knowledge. So I think this seems to be the central approach in Krishnaji's teaching, because when you talk about the other dimension, then this seems to be the only valid approach. So that is what we had been discussing in the morning. We were trying to understand what is this approach of negation and why that is required. So then we also examined some of the situations in our daily life which we consider as love. So we briefly went into the phenomenon of falling in love and tried to understand what exactly is happening there. And then we also examined few things. That means the kind of affection we feel towards others, right? The sympathy, the pity, and all those things, right? Whether they are the form of love. So we said that no, they are still the product of that same field. They are still the contents of consciousness. Then we also talked about, if at all there is a touch of that quality of love, a thing of a different dimension, then that touch affects our emotional nature, our thought nature. And we briefly went into what is the nature of those emotional responses. We said that normally our emotional responses are a response to what is happening outside. So according to that, we emotionally respond. So sometimes we are happy, sometimes we are not happy, sometimes we are jealous, sometimes we are this, sometimes we are that. So all that mental states, all those psychological states, they are according to what is happening outside. But when the emotions are affected by this quality of love, then those emotions are of completely different nature. They are not affected by what is happening outside, because then they are the true reflection of that love of different dimension. And so they are of a completely different quality, not affected by what is happening around oneself. And they come and go. You cannot control them, you cannot invite them. They come on their own, they go away. After they had gone, we have only the memory of that state of mind. And then we see that, well, that was probably that love. But then you can't repeat it. Just as you try to repeat all the other pleasures, you cannot repeat this state of mind because it is not pleasure. And so you can't do anything about it. So again, we come back to that then. The only thing that you can do is have a right kind of ground in your life where that love of different dimension is most likely to manifest, most likely to come. And that's all that can be done. So from that point of view, probably we may have to investigate our own lives and probably try to find out whether there are any activities, whether there are factors in our day-to-day life which go completely against love. And if we find them, then it is up to us to end them through understanding, through observation, to do away with them. And in the morning, we also said that the most important factor is the selfishness. Wherever there is this selfishness or self-centeredness, there the love cannot manifest. It just cannot come. And so this selfishness seems to be actually the core of our existence, because our whole life is self-centered. Everything we are doing for oneself, for us. And that creates quite a distorted perception of the world, because the world is looked at from my point of view, from my interest, from what I want, according to my likes and dislikes. And therefore, we have quite a distorted perception of the world. And then a life based on that perception is also a kind of distorted life. So then one has to be observant about this factor of selfishness as it functions in one's life. Because there again, there is no point in suppressing, there is no point in running away from it, because you cannot run away from yourself. You cannot suppress yourself. Actually, you cannot do anything about yourself, because whatever you do, that will be only a further addition to yourself. So all that can be done is just the observation, just observing oneself for whatever one is. And out of that observation, then something can happen. So I think we talked this much in the morning, and then there were some questions. So we'll take up those questions. And there is one point also where we were mentioning that as one studying Krishnamurti, that study, one finds many of the activities one was doing before as meaningless, and therefore one loses interest in those activities. So there is a loss of interest, and yet one hasn't still found out what one really interested in. So therefore, whatever interest was there before, that is lost. The new interest hasn't found yet. And so that creates some sense of staticity, in the sense that a person feels that he's stuck up probably, because he doesn't want to do all those things which he was enjoying doing before. Now they no longer interest him. And at the same time, he still doesn't know what interests him. He may try different things, but he finds that he is not interested in them. So he hasn't found out his interests yet. And therefore, he is not moving. He is just in a static state. So sometimes probably this state of mind is not that easy to face, because one may feel lonely, one may feel frustrated, one may feel despaired. and then out of that one may again take up something and continue with the old way of life. But that is where the attention is required most. It means what exactly you are feeling in that state, what exactly is happening, right? And then looking at things, observing the world around. So that has to continue, that has to go on. And maybe out of that, one may discover a different kind of movement in oneself, which is not the movement of thought, but a completely different kind of movement. Because one hasn't tried to escape from that state of mind. One is completely with it. And through that different kind of movement, then completely different possibilities, they arise. And then it is as if the person has found a new meaning to life, a new significance, which was not understandable before, but seems to have been there. And then out of that, then person will function even in his day-to-day life. So the day-to-day life situations may be the same as before. What has changed is your approach to those situations. Previously, the approach was through your interest towards the outward things. That means your interests were outward going. And according to those interests, you were approaching your daily life situations. It means, for example, if you are interested, if something is according to your interest, you used to go after it. Something is not as per your interest, that means you are not interested in that, then you used to neglect it. So your approach was based on your interests, and those interests were as per your likes and dislikes, as per whatever was happening outside. But now the approach is completely different. That different quality of movement, that different sense altogether, that is responding. And that response is totally different than the previous response. And so you discover a new meaning, a new significance in the same old things. That means outwardly life may not have changed much, but your whole approach has changed. So the same thing now looks to you or appears to you as quite different than before. And then your responses are also different completely. So that is what has to happen. And that can happen only when one is steadily observing oneself as to what is happening to one, what is one's state of mind, and not further react to it in terms of despair, disappointment, depression, and so on. Because all those states of mind are the projection of the self. The self is not getting what it wants, so it feels depressed, it feels disappointed because its expectations are not met, and so on. So it is still a very much self-centered activity. And if there is an attention, then you are not taken over by these self-centered activities, but you are aware of them, you are attentive to them. And through that attention, then there is the understanding of all this. So that was one point I think Venu had requested to go more into it. So we tried to go into it a little bit more. Now I think we can take up the remaining questions.
So is there a point in us, in our entire current chaos, to even contemplate this love, except to feel that there is no way we can reach that of a volition? Is it for us to know that there is something beyond?
Yes, I think the only thing we can say that if there is something beyond is probably the assurance given by Krishnaji himself. That means he is not giving a positive assurance in the sense that yes, there is. But then he says that it is possible to enquire into it. It is possible to come upon it. So the very possibility of coming upon it is a kind of assurance that your inquiry is worthwhile, in the sense that this kind of inquiry is worthwhile. It's not some futile act. It's not like going after the mirage, or it's not like going doing a wild goose chase and so on. So that much assurance is there. But now the other part of the question, that is there anything in our life which can take us to that quality of love? Now, love, as Krishnaji talks about, it doesn't seem to exist in our life. What exists is based on whatever we have gone through in this field of knowledge. And therefore, it's not love. But then, is there something which can be done so that that different dimension can manifest in our life, can become part of our life, or our life becomes the life of that different dimension? So that we have gone into a little bit by saying that whatever that is not love, whatever that is against the quality of love, that has to come to an end. For that quality of love to be there. So probably I think in another dialogue, maybe tomorrow in the morning, we'll try to go into those various things which are quite part of our life, but which go against the quality of love. So one of those things we have talked today, which is the self-centeredness or selfishness. That is actually the central factor, most important one, which comes in the way of love. And then, in fact, the whole of the teachings of Krishnaji is about the understanding and the dissolution of that center as the me. So there is certainly something which can be done in our life, which can make that quality of love, the manifestation of that quality of love, more possible. At all we can say, use that word more there.
When I know I am happy, I am not really happy. Similarly, when I know I am less selfish, that means still there is a concern with one's own self.
Yes, that is
Whether
true
he
in the
wants
sense
to.
that because whatever is our state of mind, which we have labeled as happiness, right? Now, when you actually look at that state of mind, you discover that it is not happiness at all. It is just a state of mind. And so, when you know that you are happy or you were happy, right, then you are no longer actually happy, because you actually find out that whatever you were calling as happiness was after all not the happiness, and therefore not worth going after. And therefore the person may seek happiness in different ways.
So that's what. Similarly, when I am less selfish,
Less selfish, that's right, the measurement. That means the self who wants to end itself, right, it cannot end itself immediately, but it wants to end itself progressively. And in that progressive end, it imagines that it is becoming less and less selfish. So a person may say that, yes, in the past I used to be very selfish, but now I am not that selfish. So it only means that certain actions which one was doing in the past, which one is now seeing as selfish actions, one is no longer doing those actions. But one is still selfish. One may be doing other actions of which one is still not aware, or the other actions which one doesn't think as selfish, but actually they may be very much self-centered. So as far as the state of mind is concerned, which is a selfish state of mind, that continues, but only the activities get replaced. So in the past, that selfish state of mind was functioning through certain set of activities, and now it doesn't function through that set of activities, and therefore it feels, or it says that it is less selfish now, because it is no longer doing those activities. But then it is doing some other activities which are still self-centered, but it hasn't noticed them yet, and therefore it thinks that it is selfless or it is less selfish. But that is just an illusion, because by saying that one is becoming less and less selfish day by day, that self is actually maintaining itself. So instead of saying that I am totally selfish, now it is saying that, well, it is working on it and it is becoming less and less selfish day by day. So eventually one day there will be no selfishness at all. But by introducing this process of progressive reduction in the selfishness, the self is actually maintaining its existence. Self is actually maintaining itself. And therefore, it is no act of unselfishness at all. So there is no reduction in selfishness. There is no such thing. Only the self has taken a different garb and saying that, yes, it's becoming less and less selfish. But actually, it is just maintaining itself.
where there are images, there is no love. I don't have images on millions of people whom I don't know. So can I presume that I love all those million of people?
So when there is image, there is no love, right? But the vice versa is not true. That means, therefore, you cannot say that where there is no image, there is love. When there is an image, there is certainly not love, because all your responses are according to that image. But the absence of image doesn't guarantee that there is love. Therefore, the other part of the question, it becomes invalid immediately. That means the persons whom I don't know doesn't mean that therefore I love them. Because absence of image doesn't mean that there is love.
Even in absence of love, absence of knowing the person, it is also image that I don't know that person.
Yeah, that's right.
Precisely, it is not without image then.
Yeah, there is still an image.
Not that prominent, but it is still image.
Yeah, it is still an image. The image that I don't know that person. So that statement itself is the image, yes, about that person, because that person is labeled as unknown, not known.
Unknown. Yeah, unknown.
Yes.
Yeah, Durga here, sir.
Yeah.
Yes,
Please,
sir.
Durga ji, go ahead. Yeah.
I just want to contribute few points, sir.
Yeah.
Like the material you have sent, like two videos.
Yeah.
The first video where it is, he says, where it is not love.
Yeah.
The video, like a few points, like, he went in a systematic order. First of all, he said, attachment is not love.
Yeah.
And he says, and time and again he's saying, see it in yourself. Otherwise, what is the use of just listening to me year after year?
Yeah.
And if you don't see it and if you don't drop it, what is the use of saying after 10 years, 20 years, nothing has changed in me?
Yeah.
Very emphatically, he was saying that.
Yeah.
So he went for quite a while about the attachment. And then he says, okay, when you have dropped the attachment, but he brought a very good important word, sir, that's responsibility.
Yeah.
You are not attached, maybe the sequence of your children, spouses, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Know that you are mostly maybe speaking about there are so many young mothers and they are talking about the children. So
Yeah.
You're attached, but at the same time, you can't shun away the responsibility towards that. So
that's
very
right.
important point he said. And then he says possessiveness, like, he said about the possessiveness is not love. You want to possess, you want to possess your daughter, you want to possess your possessiveness, not love. When you see it, you drop it, possessiveness. So we have to, like, he says, if you're not acting on them, if you're not seeing all those things, then what is the use of coming to me? I'm telling that, he kept on saying that. And the third point, sir, that he says, then he says, love for he goes even a bit ahead. He says, love for the universe, like the mountains, the hills, the environment, the nature. Responsibility is the word again. He says, responsibility. So love, according to him, is that responsibility and love for the universe itself. Those are the few fundamental points that struck, when I was just going through the video. So,
that's right.
but dimension I want to add here, sir. When we look at our lives, maybe we don't understand the dimension he was saying. Attachment, we know. Attachment and the possessiveness and all those things we know. Then he says, you find out for yourself, experiment. And you try to find out in your own self, unless and until you use your own inquiry. How do you come to know what I'm trying to tell, what he's trying to say? So basically, we're all living our lives with your spouses, your children. It's a normal daily life. So in each one of us, can we observe what according to us? We have to lead our lives. We are living our relationship. We have to work it on that. That's a groundwork for us. So what according to us, at least we are when we are having a relationship, and all, because without few elements of sanity, without so few elements of conflict within the atmosphere, we can't use our energies to go into what he's trying to say. So this is what I want to contribute, sir.
Yeah. Good, you summarized that video. So those who have not seen that video, at least they came to know what he has said in that video. And that other point which you have made is very important, because there is no point in listening to Krishnaji and saying that, oh, it was a wonderful talk, and then just continue with one's life as before. So it doesn't mean much. So one has to actually work upon oneself and try to actually understand one's life and then bring about change there. So unless one is actually doing that, just listening to Krishnamurti and saying that, yes, it is very good, very nice, it has very little value. So that point is a very good point you have brought out.
And very dramatic way, he also says, sir, you listen for 58 years and you say, I haven't been hearing to you, listen to you, but I haven't. He says, it's not with me, it's up to you.
Yeah,
I'm doing work.
Yeah,
Very tragic and dramatic.
Yeah, of course. A person has not changed. That is no fault of Krishnaji. That is, the fault is with the person himself. Maybe he hasn't been listening. Maybe he hasn't been working on himself.
Is love, as we discuss it, confined to an interpersonal, that is human to human relationship, or can we also consider it to exist towards a non-human object?
See, love is a quality of living, a quality of life. So it is life itself. So naturally, when you say life, it means life in all forms, not just the human form. Everything that exists, right? So the love is towards all those things. And therefore, you cannot say that, well, you love only the other person and you don't love anything else. Then it is not love. Then it is only an attachment. You are attached to that person, therefore you are concerned with that person. But if you say love, then love is for everything that exists. And therefore, that brings a change in your approach. That means then you behave responsibly towards all existence. Right? Then environment is also as important as other human being. Then other living forms are also as important as human form, right? And therefore, that can bring about some major changes the way you live your life. So all that, some of those things we are going to consider in tomorrow's dialogue, particularly when we will be talking about what are the factors or what are the things in our life which come in the way of love, which go against the quality of love. So probably there we will talk more elaborately about these things. But when it is love for everything that is living, not just for human beings.
So one thing, why we are so frightened to take off? We are more interested in running on the ground. We are so frightened.
That is inevitable, because we have said, when we were talking about the consciousness and when we were talking about the way the thought functions and so on, so there we had said that there is this intrinsic mechanism that every living entity first of all has to survive. And for survival, it has to be aware of the dangers to its survivals, right? And so the existence of danger gets conveyed to that living entity in the form of fear. So whenever there is a danger, there is a response which we call as fear to that danger. And then that fear makes that living entity act in a certain way so that it can save itself from that danger. So either it may fight the danger, or it may run away from the danger, or it may, whatever it can do to get rid of that danger. So fear is the response to a threat to life. That seems to be the natural mechanism. Now, what is happening in our case is we have a psychological existence as the me, that entity which we call as the me. That entity has its own psychological existence, its own psychological life. And it appears for human beings that the psychological survival seems to be far more important than the biological survival. So that is why people are willing to die for this cause or that cause, or for this idea or for this ideal and that ideal, right? So for them, the biological survival doesn't mean much. But survival for the cause, for the ideal, for whatever they have selected as most important for them. So that seems to be far more important. So if the psychological survival is far more important, then there is a threat to the psychological survival. So when there is a threat, natural response will be, of course, the fear. So the person will be afraid of such psychological threats. So therefore, anything which goes against the survival of this psychological entity will create a psychological fear in the mind, right? So that is maybe a programmed response of us. Now, the only thing that can be done is that one can only observe, one can only watch that response of fear and not get taken over by it. So maybe initially that fear will prevent you from going further in that direction. But then you can remain with that fear. You can live with it, and out of that, you will come to understand the nature of that fear. And therefore, that may just disappear, may just, you can say, wither. And then one is able to take a step forward. But that fear seems to be a major obstacle in the so-called takeoff. Because takeoff means probably the total extinction of that entity, which we call as the me or the self. And when it sees that possibility, right, then immediately there is a response of fear.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have one question. Hello.
Yeah. Please, Gajananji, go ahead. Yes.
This we're talking about negation through understanding.
Yes.
So to understand it, okay, this is attachment. Oh, this is not love. Understand it and then negate. But what actually, when I see in myself, what actually happens is, as if we identify first, oh, this is the attachment, pleasure, these possession is not fear. We target them and then we try to kill them, eliminate them. And then that is different approach. And actually understanding it. For example, I used to see a lot of TV serials. Then I actually understood, oh, I don't feel like it. But nobody told me that, oh, I TV serial, not that. I have to stop attachment. I have to stop. But it is happening. the way I'm targeting it and then want to shoot it, eliminate it, but that will not work. Actual understanding is something different quality.
Different, yeah, that's right. Actual understanding is something quite different than the intellectual understanding, because one may just accept that, well, attachment is not law, this is not law, that is not law. One has accepted it intellectually, but still those things continue in one's life, and therefore there is no law. Now those things can end only when one feels the futility of those things. Then one doesn't have to do anything, they get just dropped, because they no longer matter to oneself as far as one's life is concerned. And whatever doesn't matter, that just drops off. You never stick to it. So in that sense, it has to get negated. And that comes to that means, like you mentioned, the TV serials and all this thing. So constantly watching TV serials, the way it affects the brain and creates disorder in it, right? And then the brain simply doesn't want to continue with it because live in disorder. So there is a sense of aversion that gets created in the brain, and you cannot escape that sense of aversion. So you have to just then fall in line, and therefore those serials are no longer watched. Then that sense of aversion also withers, and then there is some kind of order in the brain. But then probably you never want to go back to watching the serials again because you have understood that that kind of watching creates this kind of state of mind, and that state of mind is a disorder. So as you rightly said, understanding is a completely different thing. It is not just intellectually agreeing or disagreeing. It is something quite different. Yes.
Sir, one question, sir.
Yeah, please.
This is regarding the connection between freedom and love.
Yeah.
So you suggested that unless there is freedom from self-centered activity,
yes,
the touch of love is not possible.
Yeah.
And yet, at the same time, in my own life, I see that whenever there is any kind of freedom, the brain really doesn't know how to handle that energy, and it just fritters it away in everything.
Yeah.
So are we really prepared to receive that touch of love?
Yeah, you see, when you have all the freedoms, Krishnaji calls it as psychological freedom. Now, the psychological freedom is the freedom to exist or to live as per your conditioning. That means there are no further impositions, no further things, right? So you are free to live as per your conditioning. In other words, it means that your conditioning is free to be what it is. So only in that state, the conditioning can be observed as it is. So that is just a conditional freedom. It is not unconditional freedom. Unconditional freedom will come only when all the conditioning has ended. But the conditioning cannot end until it is observed as it is. And to observe it as it is, there has to be this conditional freedom at least. That means the conditioning should be free to exist as it is. Only then it is observable as it is. And when it is observed as it is, then only there is a possibility of that conditioning coming to an end. But when the self interferes, then that conditioning is not free to exist as it is, because the self dictates what it should be according to its likes and dislikes, and therefore always wanting to do something about it. And therefore, then the conditioning is not free to exist as it is, but it has to exist according to what that center as the self wants it to be. Then it is not observable as it is, and therefore there is no possibility of ending of it. So therefore then, what needs to be observed is the activity of this observer. What it is doing, what it is actually feeling, and so on. So not only observing the reaction as it is arises, but the further reaction of the observer to that arising reaction, that also needs to be observed. In fact, that needs to be observed much more than the first reaction that is arising, because only through that there can be understanding of that self. So I hope I have answered your question. If you have further question to ask on whatever that has been said, you can ask.
So are we really, so unless this, say, second level of observation is also happening, we really are not prepared to, the ground is not being created for any kind of love to enter, touch us, right, sir?
No, we also talked about the possibility that the self not being active, self for the time being not being active, and that during that time period there is a possibility of that love of different dimension manifesting. We have talked about it. So we don't know what makes the self inactive, or we simply don't know. Maybe something which is very grand, when we have to see it, the self is completely taken over and no longer active. So there could be various such situations which happen in our life, and simply the grandness of the event takes over the self completely, so that it is inactive. It is no longer interfering. It just goes into the background, becomes inactive. And when the self is inactive, probably then there is a possibility of that other dimension. So maybe because of that, we do have some experiences in our life of that completely different touch. But then it comes goes, and we have no control over it. We can't do anything about it. And we have only the memories of that. So
the last question.
Also we have talked about. That's what I mean. So it's not all that hopeless situation. What I mean is.
Yes, sir. So it's the last question.
Yeah.
So the gathering of energy through observation that we talked about, that only aids in more subtle enquiry.
Yeah.
And that subtle enquiry only cleans the ground. What is the connection between energy and love, sir? So,
oh yes, that's a good question. The love is not just a quality, but the love is also the energy. And therefore, things happen when there is love. That means we have said that thought is a material process. So thought doesn't have its own energy. thought needs energy to move. And we have said that it is the psychological content which provides that energy to thought, and therefore the thought is able to move. So thought is a completely material process, and therefore it has all the material properties like inertia and not being able to move by itself, but needs to be moved from outside. But love is not a material process. Love is something totally different. So we have talked about love as a quality, but love is also an energy. And the energy of love can make things happen. Energy of love is not a destructive energy, but it is a healing energy. So healing can happen in the state of love. Krishnaji had tremendous healing capacity, about which he never talked much, but he did heal people sometimes. And when he was asked how that healing happens, so he said that it is not he who is healing. He said that something somewhere clicks and the healing happens. But then he said that for that healing to happen, one has to be completely selfless. That means the self should not be active in any way. Then only that healing is possible. So which is actually also the requirement of love. Love cannot manifest as long as the self is active. So which means that the energy of love is a healing energy. It is a harmonizing energy. So harmonizing energy means it will be always orderly. Therefore, love cannot create, or love will never create disorder in the brain or anywhere. So that's why Krishnaji says that any action emerging out of love is the right action, because it will never lead to conflict. But without love, probably all the actions are wrong because they lead to some kind of psychological conflict. So I think love as an energy is also a very tremendous aspect of that quality of love. Because then with love, anything is possible.
May I ask a question, sir?
Yeah, please go ahead, sir.
So, after all listening to this entire lecture, etc.
Yes.
So, to tell you fact,
Yeah.
and frankly,
Yeah,
so
of course.
I'm in very bad situation. When I observe myself and I observe all the relationship,
Yes.
I find that in relationship there are expectations. I
Yes.
expect something, and others also expecting something
Yeah.
every time, and
Yeah.
all expectations are never satisfied.
Yeah.
If one expectation ceases, others arises,
Yeah.
and there is no love.
Yeah.
And in my life, I find that nobody loves me, and I do not love anybody. It is very dangerous situation, sir. But I'm
Yes, of
telling you
course.
frankly, it's okay. Kindly
Yeah.
excuse me,
Yeah.
sir. And I
No,
don't
no,
know what to do. I'm unhappy, and there is a conflict
that's
and
right.
misery in my life. I'm telling frankly everything, sir. With
Right.
your
No,
kind
of course,
of
of course. No.
others
Thank
also.
you.
I
No, thank
excuse
you
for
for
others.
opening up your mind. I think you have not described only your situation, but you have described a situation of a general human being, because most of the human beings are in that situation. Neither they neither they love anybody, nor anybody loves them, and there are lots of expectations, right? But then situation is never completely hopeless, because there is always a possibility to begin afresh. There is no point in saying that, well, in the past I have tried everything and failed, nothing happened. So therefore, what is the point in trying again? Right? So if you are going to try in that sense, then maybe you are going to only repeat the same kind of action again, which had failed in the past. And so you may go on repeating that action n number of times, and every time it is going to fail because probably that is not the right action. So that will happen only when you are trying to change your life according to some system, according to some method, or according to some practices. Right? Then that is what happens. But if you say that, well, let me look at the things afresh, let me try to understand them, which means that you have put aside all your past and you are looking at those things afresh without any connection to the past. So if you are able to look like that, then there is a possibility of a completely different understanding taking place. Then you are not repeating the same mistake. Then you are really exploring. Then you are really trying to find out. So I think that is what is required. So if I have expectations from others, right, then I have to look at those expectations afresh. I should not try to justify them by saying that, well, this has to be like that, otherwise how one can live, or how life is possible, or how there can be order, and so on. Right? But maybe that is my notion, and which may be completely wrong. So I have to examine, why do I expect from others? And through those expectations, what is it that I am getting? What is my profit in that? Except the satisfaction of the ego, I don't think there is anything else that we are gaining through those expectations. If our expectations are met, we feel nice. So feeling nice is the response of the ego. The ego feels nice because its word has been kept. Its demand has been fulfilled. Its expectations are met. And therefore it feels nice. So except for that, probably there is nothing which one gains by fulfillment of those expectations. And therefore, one has to really ask, is it necessary for oneself to expect like that, to have those expectations? Or if those expectations are not there, then is the life going to be very uncomfortable, very sorrowful? In fact, the expectations are making life sorrowful, because when they are not met, then one ends up in the state of sorrow. So I think one has to begin afresh. Situation is never hopeless in one's life. Nature always leaves a room for fresh investigations, for freshly looking at things, and therefore a possibility of different understanding. So I think one should never give up. There is no such thing as giving up, because whatever you give up now will come back to you again in different form, and you will have to deal with it. So there is no such thing as giving up. One has to deal with it. If one doesn't deal with it now, one will have to deal with it in future, some other time, but it will definitely come back.
Now I am just following some escaping mechanism. I don't know whether I am correct or not. So instead of human beings, I love animals, I love buildings, trees, rivers, physics, chemistry, and biology, and music. So this is all escape from the human beings. I don't love you.
Wait, sir. Why do you call it as escape from human beings? If you say that you love nature, you love trees, you love animals, right? Then is that really love, or it is just a diversion from the situation which is arising due to your expectations? Because your expectations are not met, therefore you are getting occupied in all those things, right? So it only means that, well, now instead of interacting with human beings, because in that interaction the conflict is inevitable because of the clash of expectations, right? Then you are resorting to interaction with other things, where the other things have no expectations from you. A tree doesn't expect anything from you, so you find it much comfortable to interact with the tree. The animal doesn't have much expectation from you, except that you should not harm it, or except that you have to give something to eat to that animal. Except for those one or two things, it doesn't have any other expectations. So it becomes simpler to interact with animals, right? So maybe through those interactions, you may still learn to relate with other living beings. And through learning, you may be able to revert back to human beings also. And then the same way you may be able to relate with them. Right? So when animals and plants have no expectations from you, you also have no expectations from them. So what do you expect from a plant? What do you expect from an animal? Do you expect anything at all? Probably you don't expect anything, because they can't give you anything. Maybe it is a fruit tree, that tree may give you fruit, right? But if you expect that tree to give you fruit off season, it will not give you fruit in when it is not the season for it to give that fruit. So which means that you really can't expect anything from these plants or animals. So neither you expect from them nor they expect from you. So life is free of expectations. And if you are really able to live and relate with those things, right, then you will understand the real value of a life without expectations. And when you understand the real value of that kind of life, then maybe you will be able to relate with other human beings without expecting anything from them. They may be still expecting from you, but you don't expect anything from them. And therefore then you can respond to them, maybe taking into consideration their expectations wherever possible, or maybe discarding their expectations where it is not possible. But then there is no interference from your own expectations. So then life becomes quite simpler. So if you are really loving animals and plants and relating with them, right, then I think it is a very, very welcome step, because that can lead you to a stage where you will be able to relate in the same way with other human beings. So again, the situation is not very hopeless as you have tried to paint it, but it is very much positive situation in the sense that there is a room for real investigation and real learning.
Kishorji, can I ask a question?
Yeah, surely.
Kishorji, there was a someone whom I held in high esteem had given me these words in Hindi. I'll just read them out and then we can move ahead. He says, जैसे वृक्ष होता है, उनके मूल अंदर हैं, हिलते नहीं. जो उनकी छाया में आके रहता है, तो सहज फल पा लेता है. वृक्ष को पता भी नहीं कि कौन आया, कौन फल पाया. इसी तरह जीना है. So he says one has to be, one has to live like a tree.
Like a tree, that's right.
So the roots are within, and they are unaffected by the external environment. And the tree is not affected by who comes and sits in its shade or who takes the fruit from the tree.
Right, right.
So now what we were just talking about of a non-expecting kind of a state, and the complete absence of self. So does that become then the preparing ground for that love to flower in
that
our
is
life?
what that is what we had said earlier also, because the tree doesn't have any sense of self. Tree doesn't have any sense of self at all, and so tree is just what it is, and it is living its own life, right? And therefore, since no sense of self, so no expectations and nothing else that follows that sense of self. But human beings have strong sense of self. So if human beings are in a position to give, they will attach lots of conditions to that giving. And therefore, it is not giving at all. It is just the furthering of the self-interest of that human being. So actually living like a tree, it just means that living completely selflessly, without any sense of self. Then probably one will be able to live without any conflict. And then there is a possibility of that compassion or that love to manifest.
Sir, you are also giving love to us. You are sharing your knowledge. You are spending your time and energy for all of us, irrespective of knowing who is what. You don't know all these people personally. Why we need to take a tree example?
Sir, I'm not very sure whether I am loving or not loving, because maybe the love is not aware of itself as love. But I can say that, yes, I'm definitely concerned as a human being. I'm really concerned with other human beings also. And therefore, whatever that is right for me, it has to be right for other human beings also. So if it is right for me to enquire, to go into what Krishna ji has talked about, then it may be right for other human beings also. And if it has helped me change in some way or other, then it can also help other human beings to change their lives. And so it's a kind of inquiry or investigation together. So I don't feel that I am teaching you something or I'm giving you something, but I have this sense that by inquiring with you, I am getting clarifications. I am getting clearer and clearer in my understanding. So it's a mutual, can say, learning, in the sense that we are learning together. It's not somebody is taking a position of one who knows and then trying to transfer that knowledge to the other persons, because that is what happens in a lecture. But in a dialogue, we are not merely transmitting knowledge from one brain to another brain, but we are trying to look at the issues together, trying to understand them, so that our brains, they open up, they unfold, and maybe we are able to come upon different understanding, and which may not be possible by oneself. That means which may not be possible when one is alone or studying alone on his own. But as we have said, the life is a relationship. So therefore, learning also happens probably in relationship. When you relate with others, then that is the opportunity to learn. So all these dialogues, they are an opportunity to learn. And we have the advantage of so many brains involved in this dialogue, each contributing its own energy, its own understanding. And then there is a possibility of some common impersonal understanding evolving out of these dialogues. And I think that is probably the takeaway from these dialogues. And so such dialogues are possible only in the spirit of friendship. If we are inimical to each other, if we are competitive, if we want to only further our interest, our points of views, our opinions, then such dialogue is not possible. So there has to be a commitment to find out the truth, commitment to find out the fact. So if everybody is committed to the facts, to the truth, then there is no scope for conflict at all. Because it is then not your opinion versus my opinion, or your understanding versus my understanding, or you understand more and I understand less. So there is no such comparison at all. Then we are learning together. And in that learning together, then there is a possibility of that sense of affection, that sense of love coming into being. But if we are merely arguing, only furthering our point, like a lawyer argues in a court to prove his point. So if we are doing a similar thing in these dialogues, then they are no longer the dialogues. Then there is no commitment to truth, but there is a commitment to my own opinions, my own views, which I don't want to put aside, and therefore there is conflict. So I think these dialogues are really a very good opportunity to learn, to look at things together, because then we have far more energy available than if we are simply inquiring alone. I think that is the advantage.
Sir, if love is the word, what is
Yes.
the thing, sir? Because they say, he said the word is not the thing. If you apply
That's
that
right.
here.
That's right. Right.
Can you please.
So love is that quality, that energy. Now again, we are using different words to tell, and then we will say that that energy, that word energy is not the actual energy, or that word quality is not the actual quality. So this problem will be always there, because we are trying to communicate through words something which is different from words, and therefore this difficulty will be always there. So what we have to learn is, taking help of those words, can we go beyond those words? Can we reach that thing which is being indicated by those words? So again, Krishnaji says that that is possible only when there is love. Because when there is love, you don't need words for communication. There is a non-verbal communication possible with love. So I think that is what one has to endeavor to do. So in the dialogue, if we are merely capturing words and then interpreting them according to our knowledge, and then coming to some conclusion, and then saying that conclusion is the understanding, then I think we are missing quite a lot. Then we are merely gathering further knowledge, we are merely gathering further words, which actually don't mean anything to us, because the content is completely lost. So I think our endeavor should be to grasp that content. Well, words are there, but sometimes many people, they just get trapped or get caught up in the dispute about the words. So we are not saying that we should use any word and then the other person, it is his responsibility to capture that content. No. I mean, even the person who is using words, he has to try to use the words as close to the content as possible, so that the possibility of the other person grasping that content is more likely. So the responsibility is on both the sides. The person who is trying to convey something, right, whether he is using the right kind of words, and then the person who is listening to those words, whether he is trying to grasp the content through those words. But many times we find that the response of the persons is merely from intellectual level. So which means that actually he has no content to convey, but he is merely conveying the words and what those words mean. So it is just an intellectual exercise. Then such a discussion becomes quite meaningless. Then it only becomes sharing of opinions and sharing of one's views and so on. So if somebody says something, the other people say, oh, what a good thing. So they simply agree. Then they say something, and then this fellow agrees. And then it moves on until there is a disagreement. But there has to be the real content. That means even during the dialogue, one has to be observing oneself. What exactly is happening to oneself? Where from the response is arising? Right? Is it merely an intellectual response, or is it a response coming from much deeper level? And then out of that response, trying to convey things. Then the dialogue becomes meaningful. Otherwise, it will be merely intellectual sharing.
Sir, maybe the wrong question for this session.
Yeah.
But I remember, sir, in one of your talks or articles, you had mentioned that Krishnaji's teachings are essentially about love.
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, perhaps I'm wrong, it was also suggested that Krishnaji himself was a manifestation from that dimension of love.
Yeah.
So maybe, sir, sometime in the second session tomorrow, you could kindly take that also.
Yeah. So actually, I think it was George Bernard Shaw who said about Krishnaji that when Krishnaji entered the room, he felt that the Lord of Love has entered. And also traditionally, they say that the past Buddha, that is Gautam Buddha, was the Buddha of wisdom. But the next Buddha, which is going to be Maitreya Buddha, he will be the Buddha of love. So essentially, probably the whole of Krishnaji's teaching is probably essentially it is the teaching of love. So love not only as a quality, but love also as an energy. So love is something which is very much living, very much dynamic, not a material process. So maybe I think we'll talk about it in some session as the time permits. As next session, we are going to talk about what are those things which are coming in the way of love, which exist in our life and which probably we need to look into, and if possible, end them as quickly as possible. So we'll talk about that in our session tomorrow, first session. And then we'll see, as the time permits, we'll include other things also.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. So I think it is time to end the meeting. or
Yes,
there are further questions.
Yes.
And we'll meet tomorrow at 10:30 again.
Thank you, Kishorji.
Yeah. So thanks a lot. Thanks everybody.
Yes.
Thank you, Kishorji,
for this participation and making this dialogue happen. So I'll now end the meeting.
Yes, Kishorji.
Yes, thank you, Kishorji. Bye.
Yeah, thank you.